Some moments in life feel small on the surface, but psychologically they change everything underneath. One of those moments happens when an avoidant finally comes back after a long silence and stands in front of you again, not through a text, not through social media, not through indirect signals, but face to face, and almost nobody understands what is really happening in that moment. Because when avoidants disappear, people usually focus on the silence itself. They focus on the unanswered messages, the confusion, the emotional distance, and the cold behavior. But the real story is not always in the disappearance. The real story begins when the silence ends. That is the part nobody talks about. There is something strange about the energy of an avoidant when they finally face someone they emotionally escaped from. It feels different immediately. Sometimes they look calm, but their nervous system says something else. Sometimes they speak casually while their eyes quietly search for emotional safety. Sometimes they act distant, but underneath that distance is emotional pressure that has been building for weeks, sometimes months. And this is where most people completely misunderstand avoidance. People often believe avoidants feel nothing during separation. They assume silence means peace. They assume distance means emotional freedom. But psychology shows something far more complicated. Avoidants do not always stop feeling. They stop expressing. That is a completely different thing. Many avoidants suppress emotions instead of processing them. They disconnect externally while staying emotionally connected internally. Over time, silence starts creating psychological tension they cannot easily control anymore. That tension changes them slowly and quietly. By the time they finally face you again, something is already happening inside them, something deeper than pride, deeper than ego, deeper than simple regret. In many cases, the avoidant is no longer trying to escape you. They are trying to escape the emotional reality they spent months avoiding. That is why this moment becomes so emotionally intense. Because when they finally see you again, they are not only facing a person, they are facing memory, loss, attachment, guilt, curiosity, emotional consequences, and sometimes the painful realization that your absence affected them far more than they expected. This is also why avoidants often act strangely after long silence. Their behavior becomes unpredictable. Their tone changes, their emotional walls become unstable. One moment they seem cold, the next moment they seem unusually soft. One moment they appear detached, the next moment they look emotionally overwhelmed for reasons they cannot explain. Most people never notice these psychological shifts because they only focus on words. But avoidants reveal themselves more through emotional behavior than direct communication. The truth is that long silence affects avoidants differently than people think. At first, silence gives them relief. Relief from pressure, relief from vulnerability, relief from emotional intensity. But then something unexpected starts happening. The nervous system calms down, and suppressed emotions slowly rise back to the surface. Memories return, emotional comparisons begin, internal questions become louder. Did they lose someone important? Did they run too fast? Did silence create permanent damage? One of the most overlooked facts in attachment psychology is that avoidants often process emotional loss later than everyone else. Not immediately, later, sometimes much later. That delayed emotional processing is the reason these reunions carry such strange emotional energy, because while one person was healing openly, the avoidant may have been silently fighting emotions they never learned how to handle properly. When the reunion finally happens, many avoidants experience something internally that looks almost invisible from the outside. Emotional confrontation. Not confrontation with you, but confrontation with themselves. That is why this video matters. Today we are going to break down what really happens psychologically when an avoidant finally faces you after a long silence. You will learn why avoidants disappear emotionally in the first place, what actually happens inside them during no contact, why silence changes their emotional state over time, the hidden signs they feel the loss more deeply than they admit, why they suddenly act different when they return, and most importantly, the one psychological shift that happens almost every single time they finally stand in front of someone they tried so hard to avoid emotionally. Some of these truths are uncomfortable. Some are surprising. Some completely change the way people understand avoidant attachment forever. Because the biggest mistake people make is assuming avoidants are emotionally unaffected. In reality, many avoidants are deeply affected emotionally. They simply learn to hide emotional vulnerability behind distance, withdrawal, distraction, and silence. But silence has a limit. Eventually, reality catches up emotionally. When that happens, the avoidant often returns carrying emotions they never expected to feel this strongly. That is why you need to watch this video until the very end, because the final truth about avoidance after long silence explains something most people never fully understand: why the reunion itself often becomes more emotionally overwhelming for the avoidant than the separation ever was. Once you understand that psychological shift, their behavior suddenly starts making sense in a completely different way. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep relationship psychology, attachment theory, emotional intelligence, and motivational insights inspired by Jordan Peterson, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidance is the belief that silence means emotional detachment. From the outside, it can look that way. They disappear, they stop reaching out, they avoid conversations. Sometimes they act as if the relationship never mattered at all. But internally, the situation is often far more complicated than people realize. Avoidance may leave physically, but emotionally, the connection frequently continues in the background of their mind. Silence was never truly silence. It was emotional suppression. And suppression is not the same thing as healing. Many avoidants cope with emotional intensity by creating distance. Distance gives them temporary relief because it lowers the pressure they feel inside the relationship. But once the noise of daily distractions fades, the mind slowly starts replaying unresolved emotions. Small memories return unexpectedly. Certain conversations repeat in their head late at night. Moments they ignored emotionally before suddenly begin carrying weight. Even avoidants who appear calm on the surface often experience internal emotional replaying they never openly admit. This happens because avoidants tend to suppress emotions instead of fully processing them. Rather than sitting with discomfort, they disconnect from it. They distract themselves, they stay busy, they convince themselves they are fine. But emotions that are pushed down rarely disappear completely. They stay under the surface, building pressure quietly over time. The longer the silence continues, the heavier that emotional pressure can become. What makes this even more confusing is that avoidants often do not recognize their own emotional state immediately. Their feelings usually surface slowly and indirectly. A random memory can suddenly change their mood. Seeing something connected to the past relationship can trigger emotional discomfort they cannot explain. Even peaceful silence can start feeling emotionally loud because the connection they tried to escape still exists internally, whether they admit it or not. The reason avoidants stay away for so long is usually much deeper than simple disinterest. Most people think avoidants leave because they do not care enough, but in many cases the opposite is happening internally. The emotional connection became too intense for their nervous system to handle comfortably. What looked cold on the outside was often emotional overwhelm happening underneath the surface. Avoidants experience closeness differently than most people. The more emotionally important someone becomes, the more vulnerable they start to feel, and vulnerability can trigger fear instead of safety. This creates a painful inner conflict. Part of them wants connection, comfort, and emotional closeness. Another part of them feels trapped by those same emotions. That internal contradiction exhausts them mentally. Staying emotionally present begins to feel overwhelming, even when the relationship itself is not toxic. Small emotional moments can start feeling extremely heavy inside their mind. Deep conversations, emotional expectations, attachment, and intimacy slowly create pressure they do not know how to regulate properly. Distance becomes their way of regaining control. Silence feels safer than emotional exposure. Pulling away lowers the intensity temporarily, which is why many avoidants disappear for long periods without explanation. In that moment, avoidance feels like protection. It gives them space to calm their nervous system and escape feelings they cannot organize internally. But people often mistake this behavior for confidence or emotional independence. In reality, avoidance is usually driven by emotional self-protection, not emotional strength. Many avoidants secretly believe silence will erase their feelings over time. They convince themselves that if they stay away long enough, the emotional attachment will weaken naturally. They try to outweigh the connection instead of understanding it. At first, this strategy can feel effective because distraction creates temporary numbness, but emotions that are avoided instead of processed tend to return in unexpected ways. The mind keeps revisiting unfinished emotional experiences, especially when the connection carried real meaning. That is why long silence rarely creates true emotional closure for avoidants, even when they pretend it does. During no contact, something very complicated starts happening inside an avoidant psychologically. At first, the silence feels like relief. Their nervous system finally gets distance from emotional intensity, expectations, vulnerability, and attachment pressure. This is why many avoidants seem completely fine in the beginning. The absence of emotional closeness creates temporary calmness inside them. They feel more in control again. Their thoughts become quieter for a while, and they often convince themselves they made the right decision by pulling away, but that calmness usually does not last forever. Once the nervous system settles down, the emotional suppression slowly weakens. The mind no longer stays focused only on escape or relief. Small memories begin returning naturally. Certain words, moments, habits, and emotional experiences slowly replay in their head without warning. Sometimes it happens during quiet nights, sometimes during completely ordinary moments. A song, a place, or even silence itself can suddenly reconnect them to emotions they thought they left behind. This is when emotional curiosity quietly begins growing inside them. Avoidants often try to ignore it at first. They distract themselves, they stay busy. But curiosity has a strange psychological power. The more unresolved the emotional connection was, the harder it becomes to fully silence those thoughts internally. They begin wondering how the other person is doing. They wonder whether the connection could have worked differently. They start revisiting situations they emotionally shut down from before. At the same time, regret slowly mixes with fear. Regret because part of them starts recognizing the emotional value of the connection. Fear because reconnecting would force them to face vulnerability again. This creates another internal conflict. They miss the emotional safety of connection while still fearing emotional exposure itself. And eventually, one painful question starts appearing more often inside their mind. Did I lose someone important? That question changes the emotional direction completely, because once avoidants begin emotionally questioning the loss instead of defending the distance, silence stops feeling peaceful. It starts becoming emotionally heavy. That is usually the beginning of true emotional confrontation inside them. When avoidants finally face you again after a long silence, the emotional experience is often far more intense for them than they expected. Most avoidants spend weeks or months mentally preparing for negative reactions. They expect anger, they expect emotional pressure, they expect guilt, confrontation, or desperate attachment energy. Part of them assumes the connection is still emotionally chaotic because that is how it felt before they escaped from it. But when the reunion finally happens, reality often feels completely different from the emotional scenario they created inside their mind. One of the biggest emotional shocks for avoidants is seeing calmness instead of emotional pursuit. Your silence changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Instead of feeling chased, they suddenly feel distance in a different form, not coldness, but emotional stability. That shift affects them deeply because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, even when they pretend they are not. Calm energy removes the emotional role they expected to play. Suddenly, they are not reacting to your emotions anymore. They are left alone with their own. This creates emotional confusion internally, especially if they notice that you healed, changed, or emotionally detached during the silence. Avoidants often assume people will stay emotionally frozen around them. They expect to return and find the same emotional attachment waiting exactly where they left it, but seeing growth, confidence, or emotional peace in the other person forces them to confront something uncomfortable. Time moved forward emotionally without them. That realization can deeply affect an avoidant because it removes the illusion of control distance once gave them. During silence, they may have believed the connection was paused, but seeing you emotionally stronger makes the loss suddenly feel real in a different way. It creates an internal contradiction they struggle to process. Part of them feels relief seeing you okay, another part feels unexpectedly emotional because your healing reminds them that life continued while they stayed emotionally stuck in avoidance. This is why avoidants sometimes act nervous, unusually quiet, emotionally soft, or strangely observant during reunions. They are trying to emotionally understand a situation that no longer feels emotionally predictable to them anymore. The number one thing that happens when an avoidant finally faces you again after a long silence is emotional reflection becomes unavoidable. This is the psychological shift most people never see happening internally. During separation, avoidants often survive emotionally by staying distracted, emotionally detached, or mentally focused on relief. Distance protects them at first because it creates space between them and the emotions they were struggling to handle. But once they are standing in front of you again, that emotional protection starts breaking down. Suddenly, they are forced to feel emotions they escaped from before. Not theoretically, directly. Your presence brings emotional reality back into the room. The memories become real again. The emotional connection becomes harder to deny. The silence that once helped them avoid vulnerability no longer works the same way, and this is where emotional reflection quietly begins taking control inside them. Many avoidants experience a strange emotional awareness during these moments. They begin seeing things differently than they did before the silence. Your value becomes more visible to them because absence changed their emotional perspective. Things they minimized emotionally in the past suddenly feel important. The support you gave, the emotional safety you offered, the consistency they took for granted. Silence often removes emotional distractions and forces avoidants to recognize the emotional impact of someone after losing direct access to them. At the same time, they become deeply aware of your absence, not just physically but emotionally. They realize the energy, comfort, and connection they once escaped are no longer naturally available to them. That realization can create emotional discomfort because avoidants often assume important connections will remain emotionally accessible no matter how much distance they create. Then comes the hardest part for many avoidants, seeing their own behavior clearly. Distance sometimes gives people perspective they could not access while emotionally overwhelmed. They start recognizing moments they emotionally shut down, avoided vulnerability, pushed someone away, or created unnecessary damage. And when emotional clarity finally arrives, many avoidants quietly realize something painful internally. They are no longer only looking at what they lost. They are looking at what they destroyed through avoidance, fear, and emotional withdrawal. When avoidants reconnect after a long silence, their behavior often changes in subtle ways that most people do not immediately recognize. They may still try to appear calm or emotionally detached, but small shifts start revealing what is happening underneath the surface. One of the first changes is usually their tone. It becomes softer, less defensive, less emotionally sharp. Even when they try to keep the conversation casual, there is often a carefulness in the way they speak. It is almost as if they are trying not to damage the connection again without directly admitting they care about it. At the same time, nervous energy quietly starts appearing. Some avoidants become unusually observant during conversations. Others seem distracted, restless, or emotionally inconsistent. They may pause before responding, overthink simple interactions, or act strangely formal around someone they once felt emotionally close to. This happens because reconnecting forces them into emotional uncertainty again, and uncertainty creates anxiety for avoidance more than most people realize. Their communication also becomes indirect. Instead of openly expressing emotions, they often test emotional safety slowly. They may ask casual questions that secretly carry emotional meaning. They might bring up old memories indirectly or mention things connected to the relationship without fully explaining why. This is emotional testing. Avoidants rarely move directly toward